going to chat today a bit about the current sort of rising costs to live in and the heating, the fuel crisis and things like that, with someone from the panel. So the first question we've got is, what is the importance of a warm home?
A warm home is very, very important, I think, for people. Let's look at one of the most obvious things that anybody who actually has a warm home may miss. That's over health, because a lot of people in the worst of accommodation are experiencing situations where the building itself, of which they will have perhaps one room, is in very bad conditions for things like insulation. It may have things like damp and various other issues going on. Now, if you can't warm your room, you are running greater risks on your health, because you've been out, it's been raining, you come in, you can't afford to dry your stuff, so it remains damp for longer. You have to rely on your own body heat to dry stuff out. The building itself, in many multiple occupancy homes that are in good conditions where people are able to afford to warm things, the natural heat coming from the other flats will help you as an individual there. But when the whole building is occupied by people who cannot afford the heating, the whole building really is cold, damp, often quite smelly. If you want to wash your clothes, can you afford to dry them? And these things add up. They affect your mental well-being. At the very best, when you go and you feel down, you feel that it takes away hope, it takes away the strength within you, it saps your strength and energy. When you have to spend a big chunk of the day wrapped up in multiple layers of clothes, sometimes under the duvet, these are all very physically and mentally depressing. And the side effect of some of this is going to be extra costs to the NHS, because you get chest problems and you're not in the right condition to overcome them. You're weaker, your nutrition levels are down because you can't afford good food. And all these things are putting you into a very, very bad place. They're also not helping the country, because most people want to try and get back into some sort of work, but if you're not fit, or if you're lethargic because you just don't see the point of life, these things do not help you in wanting to get out, wanting to find work. You know that if you're moderately dry, walking out the door on a rainy day or a cold day, it's just going to make matters worse, so you want to stay in. All these things are big negatives. So keeping a warm house or home is absolutely critical to not only your well-being, but your ability to be an active member of the community.
So how do you think the price rises that we've already seen and that we can expect to see, how do you think they're going to impact on people?
Well, a lot of people on the lowest incomes, that's the absolute basic form of universal credit, are actually finding, no matter how careful they are with their money, that they're often stuck with the choice of paying the bills that they need to do, or actually eating. And when you're in that position, these are really difficult things to deal with, especially if you're a single parent with children, because if you don't pay the bills, then you're going to get yourself into more and more trouble, and you may end up losing your home. But if you pay the bills, then you can't afford to eat, or you eat very badly. You rely on local charities and the goodwill of people who provide food in food banks and so on. Now, for some people looking at it, they say, well, you've got a food bank, and that's great, but that actually is depressing your sense of self-worth and the sense of ability to cope by having to rely on other people. I think most of us would like to be living in a world where we can afford at least to survive and not have to look to charity the whole time, and that is a very draining effect on the individual. And it actually can lead to some sort of dependency culture that, well, if I need something, I'll have to get it from somebody else rather than actually standing on your own 2 feet. Now we've got all these additional costs coming down. Tesco's chairman said, I think it's this morning, that we could expect far greater price increases to come through in the next few months. That's been echoed elsewhere in terms of not just food, but basic essentials, things like toilet paper and cleaning materials and that sort of thing. Also, there was a note in the paper the other day that said the major supermarkets have their sort of list of essentials, which they try to keep the prices down on. They're reducing those numbers of products. So the inflation for people on the very edge of our society is actually considerably more than it is for people who are earning the sort of middle level of income in the country, and certainly those on a higher level. Because some of the things that are put in the basket by the number crunchers at the ONS and so on are things that we can't afford, we never buy. And so the skew is actually the wrong way around. We need to be looking at things that are absolutely essential just for getting from one day to the other. And we're obviously very worried about what's going to happen with the increase in prices of energy, because often the decision, and I know of people who literally cannot afford to have the heating on most of the time. As of today, that's before the price cap comes off. That's before the major increases start to come through. So how these people are going to survive, and literally we are probably looking at survival in one or two cases where people literally cannot afford to heat, and they get cold, they get ill, and in worst cases they lose their lives just because we haven't got the basics. Where I live, it's not common to see this, but I have experienced it in other parts of the country where people are sitting in supermarkets or libraries just to keep warm and dry, just to avoid having to pay the electric bill when they get home or to spend the evening in the dark. That's just how difficult it is, and it's going to get a heck of a lot worse. And I think a fear that a lot of us have is that the kindness of people who give to charities, often the local charities to keep them running, or donate to food banks, a lot of those people are themselves under pressure and therefore don't have the money to be so kind and generous as they would normally be. And that is all going to put pressure on the sector.
So there are plans to, at the moment, so one to pay £150 via the council tax, and also there's been announced a £200 reduction coming in October. Do you think those will work?
They may help people who are better off. I mean, first of all, some money is better than no money. But depending on how big these increases are for people living in one-room accommodation, we'll just have to see. But the fear is, and certainly the anecdotal evidence from talking to people, is that they are already facing increases, and those increases swamp these amounts. That is a difficulty. There's also the question that some people are in areas where there is discretionary removal of the council tax cost to the worst off. So if that discretion is lifted because the council says we've got to get every penny we can, whoever it is, then there's going to be additional increases there, which will just add to the problems that people are facing. But if the councils keep them, a thing I'm still trying to find out is if you are not having to pay council tax because of this discretion, would you still get the £150 rebate? That is not clear. People who are living in sheltered housing usually pay some sort of maintenance charge once a month, which is a contribution towards all their costs. Now, where are the charities going to get the money from? Again, I've seen nothing from the Chancellor that says we recognise that there are charities, housing associations that are covering a lot of costs themselves and only taking a contribution. So we, the government, will put money in the pocket of the charities. If they don't do that, the charities are going to have a real problem trying to make ends meet. They may be forced to put up the maintenance charges. Again, can those people actually afford the increases? So I really think somebody needs to sit down and look at real sums for real people, and be blunt about it and to say, do you actually have to spend money on X, Y, and Z? But we also recognise that on A, B, and C, you do have to spend that money, and actually look at people's budgets and say, can you afford to carry on the way you're going? And the answer for many is definitely not. So we need to look at that. We also need to look beyond the homeless sector to people like care workers and nurses who are typically brought up by people in Parliament to say, what a great job they're doing, which they do. But these people are already using food banks. What is the impact of these price rises going to be on them? And this is going to shake down from the people who can cope all the way through the people who are just coping, right down to the bottom end of the economy. And there's a lot of people who are above and beyond homelessness at the moment who may be forced into debts that they can't afford to maintain, or be unable to pay their bills, and therefore end up in their turn joining the ranks of the homeless. So there's some very real issues in here which need to be tackled, and need to be tackled very, very fast.
You said a bit about how it affects people experiencing homelessness. What do you think the effect might be on people with addictions, for example?
This is a massive problem already. If you're lucky enough not to have addictions, then it can be very, very hard to understand what it's like for somebody who has drugs and alcohol or other addictions, because the compulsion for these people to prioritize buying another bottle of vodka, buying whatever drug it is they take, is so strong that they would rather go hungry. They neglect themselves in order to pay for those addictions. Now, it is easy to say, well, they shouldn't do it. We are where we are. So if somebody is in that position, then how are they going to afford things going forward? They already are struggling to afford going forward. One of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons people take to drink and drugs is to cope with their circumstances. They're depressed, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their homes. They're in the impossible situation of saying, I cannot afford, I want to be a responsible citizen, I just cannot afford to pay the bills. The sums do not add up. What do I do? And that's often a trigger for people to start towards these sort of things of trying to help themselves get through the day and the week. And so I think there will be realistically more people falling into addiction, or who perhaps got out of it, falling back into it. So there are some very serious issues here that we need to, again, consider, because the pressure on somebody may be difficult for a person who's never had these pressures to understand, but they are there because we can see the effect of that on the people in this country who are suffering. And by the way, you don't have to be badly off to have addiction problems. Some of the wealthiest people in the world can have addiction problems. So if they can suffer with those problems, think how much harder it is for people who really just don't know where they're going to turn to in life, because they feel so oppressed by what's going on in their world that they see no options, no hope. And that's one of the problems with homelessness and addictions when they're combined, is you get to a point of no hope. And every time you try to do something, you feel that you're being slapped back. So what's the point of trying to do something? So yes, I think there's a real concern that we will see a rise of that. And obviously the cost rises are going to put people in even more difficult positions.
What about things like transport? How's that going to be affecting people?
Well, transport is already an issue, regardless of how well off you are, unless, of course, you don't never have to worry about costs. But for an awful lot of people, if you are lucky enough to be in a city, a town that is well run and has got a good range of transport links, life can be fairly well maintained. But the most obvious problem are for people who are living in rural communities. Often they don't get much in the way of transport. So unlike somebody like myself living in a city where if I miss one bus, there's going to be another one along in 5, 10, 15 minutes. If they miss a bus, that's it for the day. And then you've got to look, obviously, at the costs. And whereas for those who don't have to watch the pennies, the costs often look relatively small. When literally trying to find £5 for something in a week is going to be difficult, to have to deal with transport costs on top requires even more tighter budgeting. Again, it can look as though it's only a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, but actually planning a journey and thinking, right, this week I need to go to A, B, and C. For somebody who doesn't worry about money, they can just do it when they want to, and that may be one journey or 3. But if you are really tight on funds, you actually have to sit down and think, right, how can I plan those things that I need to do and do them in one journey in order to save money? And if you drop the ball, or you find the place is shut, or there's been a delay in the traffic or something, and what should be a half-hour journey becomes an hour journey, and you've missed something, then you're left with an unfinished task and no money to get yourself from A to B. And if that is a question that you miss getting to the job centre for an appointment, that can have penalties that it's very difficult to explain to the system. The people in the system may understand, but if the system doesn't have any tolerance, all the understanding and kindness from staff makes no difference. You can get into problems because you failed to attend an appointment.
What solutions do you think there are available? What could the government do to help with this?
Obviously, we know, as much as we'd like to see magic money trees growing in the hedgerow, such things don't exist. But I think if we want to try and lift people out of the worst situations, we do need to understand better what are the problems on the ground, really get it into the heads of the officials in the ministries and the parliamentarians to say, we have really understood where the problems lie. Once you understand that, you can then see why things are not adding up, and also why there are relatively higher costs for people at the bottom end of the pile than would be the case of somebody further up. And so you can start planning accordingly. And one of the things you come across time and again is the big drop-off there is between somebody under full support from the economy, from the country, and the basic hit that they take when they start taking on work. And some of the effects can be so big, it's economically mad to actually try and work, or to work above certain thresholds. And that is a ridiculous situation to be in, because when you've got somebody willing and capable of working, who can lift themselves out of difficulty, you want to make that path as smooth as possible. And this issue about the drop-off on what you receive in support and comparing that with what you're trying to earn can be so big that it actually works against everybody. It works against what the state wants, what the country wants, and what the individual who's trying to better themselves wants. And that's one of the reasons for the depression and the sense of giving up and pointlessness that a lot of people face. Another thing that needs to be considered is, in a sense, quite rightly, the government is saying people need to get back to work. But if a combination of the drop-off and, for example, transport costs are such, then things that could otherwise work will not happen. And again, people need to, who actually are in authority, need to go to those areas where transport links are really bad and relative costs are high, and say, in practice, we have a person here who wants to do what we ask of them. What do we need to do as a government to actually make that realistic and possible? And so I think there's a lot of levels we need to look at. We talked a bit about the oncoming storm of the higher energy costs and so on. I mean, one area which is topical, we've got our Chancellor wanting to raise funds for something that as a country we know we need, which is more investment in national health and care. We all understand that. But with respect to the Treasury, they actually have got it slightly wrong. Where they've got it wrong is not to raise the funds, it's to raise the funds across the whole spectrum of people's incomes. And if you're on a low income, it may not sound a lot to say you're paying an extra 1.25% or your employer's paying a bit more, but it's all a drag on the system. And my humble suggestion is pick a number that's, say, the middle earning level in the country, and everybody above that, they will have to pay that much more. But for those below it, for the foreseeable future, by which we're looking at 1, 2, 3 years, maybe more, will be exempt. That is a positive thing because it doesn't discourage employers from taking additional staff on because they're not having to pay that extra bit. And it means it's just that little bit more money in the pockets for those who are trying to get from A to B. So I would suggest that all these factors are looked at and looked at very quickly, because they affect everybody from those who are homeless, those who are in some sort of temporary or transitory accommodation, all the way up to the people who are trying to climb out even further. And if we can get this right, then more people will get through and there'll be less costs on the country. But if we carry on getting it wrong, all we're doing is creating a bigger mess.
So if you had one message to the government, what would that one message be?
Understand the real budgets of the people who are worst off, and also the charities and other organisations, including local councils, who are trying to find the money to support these people, because there is a risk of more rationing from councils who just haven't got the money to go round. There is a risk of, especially some of the smaller charities, having to cut back, or in the worst cases, actually not being able to cope. And so actually understanding what's going on, what is demotivating people in the system, rather than lifting them up and giving them a route back to the main part of the economy. So understand your numbers, understand the impacts, what's affecting people, and not just simply say, oh, we spent an extra £1 million. What's that £1 million look like on the ground in terms of real change for people? So understand your numbers, I think, is the basic thing.